He never thought a simple walk home could feel like stepping into a battlefield. The sun had just begun to set, washing the city in orange light, but for him, that glow only meant danger was closer. Every sound echoed louder: the hum of cars, the whistle of a distant train, the faint shuffle of shoes behind him. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Before we begin this intense story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Your support keeps powerful stories like this alive. He had learned long ago that being cautious wasn't fear. It was instinct. And tonight that instinct whispered that something was about to go wrong. His name was Marcus, 22, college student, artist, dreamer. And yet to many, before any of that, he was simply a black man walking alone at dusk. The same streets that held his childhood memories now held shadows that watched, judged, and sometimes attacked. He had headphones in, but no music was playing. It was his way of pretending not to hear the world that often spoke too loudly against him. He saw the reflection of a patrol car glide along the glass windows of the shops nearby. It slowed down just a bit too long. His pulse raced. Maybe they'd pass. Perhaps tonight they wouldn't see him as a threat, but fate had a cruel way of finding him, even when he tried to disappear. The siren blipped once, a short, sharp sound that cut through the air like a warning shot. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" The voice came from behind him. He froze, every muscle tightened. He had heard those words before, on the news, in the protests, in the last moments of people who never made it home. Slowly he turned, hands visible, body still. Two officers stepped out, hands on their belts, eyes cold. "Where are you headed?" one asked, his tone more accusation than question. "Home," Marcus replied quietly. "Just home." The other officer chuckled. "Sure, let's see some ID." Marcus reached slowly into his pocket, heart hammering so hard he could hear it. "Careful!" one barked, hand twitching toward his weapon. Marcus stopped mid-motion. "It's just my wallet," he whispered. But in that split second, his life balanced on an invisible thread, one wrong move, one misread intention, and that thread could snap forever. The street was silent except for the faint hiss of the nearby streetlight. The officers circled him like wolves deciding whether to bite. "You match a description," one muttered. "Tall, dark hoodie, dark jeans." Marcus swallowed. "A description of who?" No answer. Just silence. And the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. People began watching from windows, phones raised, but no one spoke. This was a scene everyone knew too well. He could feel anger rising, but fear anchored him. He thought of his mother, how she always told him to stay calm, to come home safe no matter what. He forced a shaky breath, eyes low, voice steady. "Please, I didn't do anything." But justice didn't care for quiet pleas that night. When they told him to kneel, he did. When they told him to put his hands behind his head, he did. Every motion felt like a betrayal of his dignity, but he chose life over pride. One officer roughly searched his backpack, tossing out sketchbooks and pencils. "Art, huh?" he sneered. "That's what you call it?" Marcus said nothing. Inside, his thoughts screamed. Every pencil, every drawing, every dream he'd built was now scattered on the pavement, trampled by boots that saw him as less than human. The crowd grew. Phones recorded. The air thickened with tension, one heartbeat away from breaking. Then, a new sound. Tires screeched as another car pulled up fast. Marcus's best friend, Devin, had arrived. "Marcus!" he yelled. The officers turned. Devin raised his hands, voice trembling. "He didn't do anything. That's my friend." "Step back!" the officer shouted, hand moving closer to his holster again. Marcus's eyes widened. "Devin, please," he whispered. But Devin took one step forward, and that was enough. "Back!" the officer roared, and the moment exploded into chaos. The next seconds were a blur of shouts, movement, and fear. Someone grabbed Marcus, forcing him to the ground. His cheeks scraped the asphalt. He could taste metal, blood or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. Devin screamed, "He's not resisting!" But the world had gone deaf to reason. Somewhere a camera flashed. Somewhere else, a siren wailed again. And somewhere deep inside Marcus, something cracked. The quiet belief that being good, being peaceful, being human could ever be enough. He lay there handcuffed, surrounded by flashing red and blue lights that painted the night like a warning. Faces blurred around him, but one image stayed clear, the reflection of his own terrified eyes in the side of the police car. He didn't see guilt there. He saw disbelief. He saw the crushing truth that no matter what he did, some people would never see him as innocent. The car door slammed, locking him in darkness. And in that darkness, the story of his life took a turn he would never forget. He sat in the back of the police car, wrists bound, staring through the cage of metal that divided him from the world outside. The city he had grown up in, the one he'd trusted, laughed in, dreamed in, now looked like a stranger's world seen through prison glass. The engine hummed as the car moved, each vibration echoing through his body like a countdown to something worse. He wanted to ask why, but the answer already lived heavy in his chest. His skin had answered for him. His silence was safer than any word he could speak. Through the window, he saw his own sketchbook left behind on the street, pages fluttering under the headlights like wounded birds. Each drawing represented something pure, something hopeful, his way of seeing light in dark places. Now they were dirt-stained, torn, forgotten. He wondered if that was how they saw him, too. The officer in the passenger seat turned slightly, his voice cold, rehearsed. "You keep your mouth shut and we won't have a problem." Marcus nodded faintly. He didn't trust his voice not to break. At the station, the fluorescent lights were blinding. They made everything look sterile, emotionless, and yet somehow dirty at the same time. He was led down a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and fear. They sat him in a small room with metal walls, a single table, and a camera blinking red in the corner. The air conditioner hummed too loudly. He rubbed his wrists, still sore from the cuffs. An older officer walked in, papers in hand, eyes already judging before the first question left his mouth. "So," he began slowly, "you want to tell me where you were around 7:30? Marcus's throat felt dry. "I told the others. I was walking home from work." "And you expect me to believe that?" the officer replied, leaning closer, his breath sour with coffee and suspicion. "You match the description of a robbery suspect." Marcus blinked. "Robbery? I don't even—" The officer cut him off with a loud smack on the table. "Don't play games, son. We found you near the scene." "Scene? What scene?" Marcus had no idea what he was talking about, but he could see from the man's tone that the details didn't matter. His guilt had been written long before tonight. He tried to breathe steadily, to think of his mom's voice. "Keep calm, baby. They can't use calm against you." But calm was hard to find when every word you spoke sounded like a weapon that could be turned back on you, and hours passed in that room. No food, no water, no lawyer, just questions stacked like bricks meant to cage him tighter. The more he denied, the deeper they dug. "You were running, weren't you? You threw something? Who were you meeting?" Every question was a trap, every pause a threat. When he finally whispered, "I want to call my mom," the officer smirked. "You'll get your call when we're done." Meanwhile, outside those walls, Devin was doing everything he could to find help. He called Marcus's mother, his college advisor, and anyone who would listen. Social media had already picked up the video, and justice for Marcus began spreading fast. Strangers shared it, activists reposted it, and slowly, the world started to watch. But inside that room, Marcus knew nothing of it. He was alone in a storm of fluorescent light and unspoken bias. The officer came back again, this time with two others. They set down photos, blurry stills from a gas station robbery. "That's not me," Marcus said immediately. "Look again," the officer pressed. "That's a hoodie just like yours. Same build." "Lots of people have hoodies," Marcus replied, voice shaking. "Not lots of people look like you," one of them muttered under his breath. The words hit him harder than the cuffs ever could. He stared at them, disbelief and rage twisting inside him. "You're saying I did this because I'm black," he said softly. "We didn't say that," the officer replied, pretending calm. "But if the shoe fits—" They laughed. Not all of them, but enough. It was the kind of laughter that stripped dignity clean off the bone. Marcus's eyes burned, not with tears, but with a heat so raw it felt like fire under his skin. He wanted to scream, to flip the table, to tell them how wrong they were, but he didn't, because he knew how that story ended. So he sat still, chest rising and falling, like a man trying to hold back a storm. Hours later, a younger officer quietly walked in. His expression was different, tired, almost regretful. "You didn't do it, did you?" he said in a whisper. Marcus looked up, unsure if it was a trick. "No," he said firmly. The young officer sighed, glancing at the camera in the corner. "They already know. The real guy got picked up 2 hours ago. They don't want to admit they were wrong." Marcus's stomach dropped. "Then why am I still here?" The officer hesitated. "Because they want the story to fade. They'll release you later, quietly. No apology, no statement. Just walk out like nothing happened." Marcus felt the room spin. So this was justice? Silence over truth? Erasure over accountability? When they finally let him go, the night had turned to dawn. He stepped outside, the morning air heavy with dew and exhaustion. Devon was waiting, eyes red from anger and worry. Marcus barely spoke. They just stood there, under the gray light, the world slowly waking around them as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside, everything had changed. The station doors closed behind him with a metallic thud that felt final, like a line drawn between who he used to be and who he was now. He walked down the street, his shadow long and fractured on the pavement. Every glance from a passerby felt sharper now, every siren in the distance louder. The city hadn't changed, but his place in it had. Later that day, his story hit the news. The video had gone viral. Protesters began to gather, signs raised high, demanding accountability. Justice for Marcus echoed through the streets he once patrolled. Reporters called, activists reached out, but Marcus couldn't speak yet. How do you explain to the world what it feels like to have your dignity crushed and your humanity questioned, only to be told, "You're free now. Go home"? Freedom felt smaller now, tainted. His mother hugged him when he got home, whispering, "You made it, thank God you made it." But her tears said the rest. How many mothers didn't get to say those words? As the days passed, the noise grew. Interviews, articles, TV debates. People are arguing over whether it was really racism or just a misunderstanding. But Marcus didn't need the world's theories. He had lived the truth. He had seen it in their eyes. He had felt it in their laughter. He had survived it. Yet surviving wasn't victory. It was endurance. And endurance shouldn't have to be his birthright. That night, as he sat at his desk, he opened a blank page and began to draw again. His hand trembled at first, but then the lines came, bold, unflinching, raw. He was drawn to the city as he saw it now, bright on the surface, bleeding underneath. He pulled himself, standing small but unbroken. He drew every face that had looked away, and when he was done, he looked at the sketch and whispered to himself, "They can't silence what's seen." But even as he spoke, he knew this was just the beginning. Because for every Marcus, there were countless others whose names never made it to the screen. He thought of them all that night, the unseen, the unheard, the forgotten. And he promised quietly but fiercely that his voice wouldn't be one of them. The courtroom was packed, cameras flashing like restless lightning, reporters whispering to one another, waiting for something sensational to erupt. Marcus sat at the defense table, the air thick with tension and judgment. His lawyer, a woman named Alicia Grant, leaned toward him and whispered, "Remember, whatever happens, you stay calm." He nodded, though calm had become an empty word to him. Every eye in the room carried the same unspoken question. Was he guilty? Not of the crime. No, that had already been proven false, but guilty of stepping out of his assigned place in a world still chained by its own blindness. The prosecutor stood, his tone sharp and rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, though Mr. Harris has been cleared of robbery, his actions that night raise further questions." The crowd murmured. Alicia's eyes narrowed. "Further questions?" she muttered under her breath. "They can't let it go." The prosecutor continued. "Why was he resisting? Why did he seem suspicious? Why? Objection!" Alicia's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "My client didn't resist anything. He was harassed, detained unlawfully, and humiliated for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time." The judge, an older man with a weary face, tapped his gavel once. "Order!" But even he couldn't hide the discomfort in his expression. The air vibrated with tension. Marcus looked around, at the jury, at the audience, at the officers seated in the back. Every stare felt like a weight pressing on his chest. Alicia rose and walked to the center of the room. "Let me ask you all something," she said, her voice rising with quiet fire. If Marcus Harris looked different, dressed differently, or came from a different zip code, would he be sitting here today? Silence. Her words hung heavy. "Because we have video evidence, we have timestamps, we have eyewitnesses. Everything proves his innocence. And yet here we are. Why? Because in this country, sometimes the truth isn't enough when the skin tells another story." Her words struck a chord. People shifted uncomfortably. A man in the jury box looked down. The cameras zoomed closer. Marcus's mother sat in the back, clutching her hands so tight they trembled. Then a sound echoed from the hallway, a protest chant growing louder. "Justice for Marcus! Justice for Marcus!" The courtroom guards moved quickly, but the noise seeped in through the walls, the rhythm steady, undeniable. The judge sighed. "We'll take a short recess," he said, striking his gavel again. But Marcus didn't move. For the first time he felt the power shift, not in his favor, but toward truth. Outside, hundreds stood in the rain, holding signs. Strangers who had never met him, who only knew his story, his pain, his face on a screen. "They're out there for you," Alicia said softly, looking through the window. Marcus swallowed hard. "No," he said. "They're out there for everyone like me." Later that evening, a new video surfaced. Body cam footage from one of the officers. It showed everything. Marcus's calm voice asked why he was stopped. The unnecessary shove, the smirk, the slurs under breath. The power in that footage wasn't in the violence, it was in the truth it couldn't hide. It spread like wildfire, the city igniting with anger and sorrow. Back in the courtroom, Alicia pressed play on the footage. The silence was deafening as the officer's words filled the speakers. Even the judge shifted uncomfortably. "This," Alicia said firmly, "is what Marcus endured. This is what so many endure. And this," she pointed to the screen, "is why silence is not an option." The prosecutor tried to object again, but his voice faltered. The truth had already spoken louder than he ever could. The judge cleared his throat. "Case dismissed," he said finally, his voice almost hoarse. "Mr. Harris, you are free to go." But freedom didn't feel like victory. As Marcus stepped outside, flashes from cameras blinded him. Microphones surrounded him as reporters shouted, "Marcus, what do you want to say to America?" He looked straight ahead, the wind cold against his face, the world suddenly vast and heavy. "I don't want to say anything," he said quietly. "I want to see change." That night the city was alive with protests. Crowds marched through the streets, candles flickering like stars swallowed by the darkness. Murals appeared overnight, his face painted on walls, surrounded by words like hope, courage, truth. Marcus stood in the shadows, watching. He didn't ask for fame, for a spotlight, for any of it. He just wanted to breathe without fear. But change never came easily. Weeks later, the department released a statement calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. No names, no accountability, just a polished apology that felt colder than silence. The same officers kept their badges. The same system remained untouched. Still, something was different. People were talking, marching, writing. His story had become a spark. Students painted signs. Mothers prayed louder. Communities gathered. The fire that began in one small room now stretched across the nation. And Marcus? He didn't stop drawing. His art turned into movement. Posters, murals, and exhibitions that traveled across cities. Every piece told a truth too powerful to erase. At one gallery, a small child looked up at his painting and asked, "Is that you?" Marcus smiled softly. "It could be me. It could be anyone." But inside him a war still raged. Fame brought eyes, not healing. He woke up at night hearing the echoes of that officer's voice, feeling the cold steel on his wrists. He smiled for interviews, but his mind carried the weight of every face yet to be seen. One evening, he stood before a crowd at a university event. Cameras ready, lights bright. He took the mic, hesitated, then spoke. "They told me to move on. But moving on means pretending it didn't happen. And I can't do that, because every time I close my eyes, I see it happening again, to someone else. So if I stay silent, I'm part of the problem." His voice trembled. Not from weakness, but from truth. "I'm not a symbol. I'm a reminder that we still have a long way to go." Applause thundered. Some cried. Some stood in silence, feeling the weight of his words. Marcus stepped back from the mic, the spotlight warm on his face. For the first time, he didn't feel small. He felt seen, not as a victim, but as a voice. But as he walked off stage, his mother met him backstage, tears in her eyes. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "But promise me something." He nodded. "Promise me you'll stay safe." He smiled faintly. "I'll try, Mama." But deep down, he knew safety wasn't promised to people like him. It was borrowed, fragile, conditional. Outside, the night sky stretched wide. Sirens wailed in the distance again, faint but familiar. He watched them fade, his reflection mirrored in a glass window beside the stage, half light, half shadow. The world was still broken, but maybe, just maybe, his story had cracked something open. The night after the court ruling, the city felt different. Not quieter, but thoughtful. Rain tapped against windows, washing the streets clean, yet leaving behind an invisible aftertaste. The aftertaste of change. Marcus sat in his apartment, the glow from his laptop illuminating tired eyes. Headlines scrolled endlessly, his name everywhere, his face everywhere. He should have felt victorious, vindicated. But all he felt was empty, like he had traded peace for a story that wasn't supposed to be his. The walls around him felt both too close and too far. His phone buzzed endlessly, messages from strangers, journalists, and activists thanking him, praising him, calling him brave. Yet bravery didn't feel like this. Bravery, he thought, should feel freeing. Instead, it felt heavy, like chains made of expectations. He closed the laptop and stared at his sketchbook. It lay open on his desk, untouched for days. The last drawing was of his mother's hands holding his when he was a child. Lines rough, smudged with charcoal. He traced them with his finger and whispered, "I'm still holding on, Mama." Then, as if guided by something more profound, he picked up his pencil again. Slowly, steadily, he began to draw. Not himself this time, but others. Faces of people who didn't have cameras or lawyers or second chances. He pulled them with eyes full of strength, mouths half open as if ready to speak. Page after page, he filled his book until dawn touched the horizon. The drawings looked like a chorus, a silent army waiting to be seen. By morning, he knew what he had to do. He gathered his sketches, scanned them, and uploaded them online with one caption. "These are the faces you don't see." Within hours, his post exploded, thousands of shares, messages from across the world. People began tagging stories, adding names of victims forgotten by headlines. Artists joined him, teachers, even students. What started as his pain became a movement. A few weeks later, a foundation invited Marcus to speak at a youth conference. The room was filled with hundreds of students, some barely teenagers holding notebooks, pens, and hope. He stood before them, nervous but grounded. "I'm not here because I wanted to be a symbol," he began. "I'm here because I survived something that too many don't. And survival," he paused, "isn't the goal anymore. The goal is to live without fear." The crowd listened, silent, absorbing every word. He told them about the night he was arrested, about the laughter, about the way silence can feel like suffocation. He didn't raise his voice, but his truth carried louder than any microphone. After the talk, a young girl approached him, clutching a worn sketch pad. "Your story made me want to draw again," she said shyly. "I stopped after my brother—" She trailed off, eyes glistening. Marcus gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then draw for him," he said softly. "Let the world see him through your lines." She nodded, and in that moment, he realized something he hadn't before. Change wasn't always loud or instant. Sometimes it began in whispers, in art, in one person deciding not to stay silent anymore. As weeks turned into months, Marcus traveled to schools, community centers, and small towns, sharing his art and his story. Everywhere he went, he saw pieces of himself reflected: fear, anger, hope, resilience. The pain didn't vanish, but it transformed. He started a nonprofit dedicated to creative justice, helping others express their stories through art. It wasn't about revenge or fame. It was about remembrance, healing, truth. But even as progress bloomed, the world reminded him how fragile hope could be. News broke of another young man killed in a traffic stop, another family crying on the evening news. Marcus turned off the TV and sat still, the silence pressing against him. The storm hadn't passed, it had only paused. "How many more?" he whispered to the empty room. The question didn't need an answer. The ache of it filled the space. Later that night, he painted again. This time, a mural that would cover an entire city wall. He worked until his hands cramped, blending colors that screamed and prayed simultaneously. Reds for rage, blues for mourning, gold for resilience. When it was done, he stepped back. The mural showed countless faces, each connected by threads of light, each reaching toward something brighter. At the center stood one figure, not Marcus, but a silhouette holding a candle high, flames reflecting in 1,000 unseen eyes. The next morning, people gathered around the mural, taking photos, leaving flowers, and lighting candles. Someone had written beneath it in chalk, "We are still here." Marcus stood at a distance, hood pulled up, unseen among the crowd. And for once he smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had begun. Weeks later, he received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a letter from the young officer who had whispered to him that night in the interrogation room. "You were right," it read. "They didn't want to admit the truth. I left the force. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I'm sorry for everything." Marcus read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his sketchbook between the pages of his drawings. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close. Months passed. The world kept spinning, headlines changing, stories fading, but Marcus's art endured. One day, he stood in a museum where his mural sketches now hung. Families walked by, children pointed, people whispered. A woman touched one of the paintings gently and said, This feels alive." Marcus turned to her and smiled. "It's supposed to," he said. "It's all of us." That night, he returned home and stood by his window. The city lights blinked like stars caught in concrete. He thought about everything: the arrest, the laughter, the silence, the protests, the art, the people who found courage through his pain. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight lift, piece by piece. The fight wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But for the first time, he didn't feel like a victim of it. He felt like part of its change. He whispered into the night, "They can take our peace, but not our purpose." The wind seemed to carry his words, echoing faintly through the streets below. Somewhere a siren wailed again, but this time he didn't flinch. He made it home that night, but something inside him had shifted forever. The air in his apartment felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves had witnessed the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. He dropped his bag near the door, the sound echoing through the silence. His reflection in the mirror caught his attention: tired eyes, trembling hands, and a face that looked the same, yet wasn't. It wasn't just fear that lingered. It was the realization that no matter how careful he was, no matter how polite, educated, or composed he was, his skin alone was enough to put him in danger. He sat on the edge of his bed, the night still echoing in his head, the shouts, the humiliation, the fear of dying for nothing. And then came the anger. Not the reckless kind, but the kind that builds deep in the soul, the kind that demands change. He had spent his life trying to fit into a world that had already judged him before he spoke. But now he understood. The problem wasn't him. It was the system that had been built on fear, silence, and centuries of injustice. He reached for his phone, not to escape into distraction, but to share the truth. He began to record, not as a victim, but as a voice. His story, raw and unfiltered, poured out like fire. He spoke about what it feels like to be followed in a store, to cross the street at night and hear doors lock, to have to teach your little brother how to stay alive when the police pull you over. His video spread fast, resonating with thousands who saw their own pain in his words. Messages flooded in, some from people who had faced the same fear, others from those who had finally opened their eyes. "I didn't know it was like this," one wrote. "Now I do." For the first time, he didn't feel alone. He wasn't just a name in the headlines. He was part of something bigger, something rising. Across the country, protests sparked again, voices shouting in unison for justice, for dignity, for the simple right to exist without fear. The faces in the crowd were of every color: black, white, brown, all standing shoulder to shoulder under one sky. And as he watched footage of people marching, holding signs that read, "Enough is enough" and "Justice for all," he felt a tear fall, not from sadness, but from hope. The world had finally started listening. He stepped outside one morning, the sun breaking through the gray clouds. The same streets that once made him afraid now felt different. There was still danger, yes, but also courage. a kind of collective heartbeat that said, "Keep going." He passed by a mural painted on the wall, his own face, surrounded by words of strength and unity. Below it, someone had written, "His story woke us up." He stood there staring, heart heavy yet proud. Change wouldn't happen overnight, he knew that. But every story told, every march walked, every voice raised, it all mattered. Because silence was no longer an option. Somewhere in the city, a siren wailed in the distance. But this time he didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, lifted his head, and kept walking. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living for himself, for those who never got the chance, and for the next generation that deserved better. His story wasn't just about pain. It was about power. It was proof that one moment, one voice, one act of courage could ripple through the world and break centuries of silence. And in that truth there was hope. He looked up at the skyline, whispering to himself, "They tried to silence me, but all they did was make me louder." The camera zooms out as his silhouette fades into the crowd, a symbol of millions who refuse to bow to hate. Somewhere in that crowd, another young soul watches, inspired, realizing that fear can be turned into fire. The narrator's voice breaks softly through the air. Maybe the world doesn't change overnight. Maybe it takes one story at a time. But if you're hearing this, if your heart is beating, then you're part of the change. A moment of silence follows, heavy yet full of meaning. The screen fades to black, and a final line appears in the mind's echo. He made it home that night, but not unchanged. And maybe that's how revolutions begin. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps more voices be heard.